porch chair creaked in the October wind, its familiar rhythm marking time like a metronome of solitude. William Bill Harrison sat in his weathered rocker, watching the Kansas prairie stretch endlessly toward the horizon, amber waves of wheat stubble catching the last light of another dying day. 20 years had passed since Eleanor's funeral, 20 winters of sitting in this same spot, 20 springs of watching the land come alive without her laughter to share it with. At 73, Bill had become as much a fixture of this ranch as the old red barn or the windmill that squeaked when storms were coming. The ranch had been in the Harrison family for 4 generations, 1,500 acres of prime Kansas farmland that had weathered the Dust Bowl, the Depression, and every economic downturn since. Bill still worked it mostly alone, though neighbors often stopped by with offers of help he was too proud to accept. His weathered hands, gnarled with arthritis but still strong, could repair fence, birth calves, and coax life from the stubborn prairie soil. But they couldn't fill the silence that had settled over the farmhouse like dust after a storm. Inside, the house remained exactly as Eleanor had left it. Her reading glasses still sat on the kitchen table next to a book she'd never finished. Her apron hung on the hook by the stove, faded blue cotton that still held the faintest scent of her lavender soap. The neighbors had long since stopped suggesting he might want to make some changes, understanding that grief had its own timeline, especially for a man who'd loved one woman for 53 years and lost her to a cancer that took everything slowly, methodically, without mercy. The sun disappeared behind the tree line, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that Eleanor had always called God's masterpiece. Bill finished his coffee, cold now in the chipped mug that had been his father's, and prepared to head inside to another evening of silence. But something caught his eye on the gravel road that led to his front gate. A figure walking, small against the vast landscape, moving with purpose despite the gathering darkness. In 20 years of self-imposed isolation, Bill couldn't remember the last time someone had approached his ranch on foot. The woman who appeared at Bill's gate as full darkness settled over the Kansas plains was unlike anyone he'd seen in these parts. She was clearly Native American, perhaps in her early 50s, with long black hair streaked with silver that she wore in a single braid down her back. What caught Bill's attention immediately was the eagle feather woven into her hair just above her left ear, its white and brown patterns catching the porch light as she approached. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to walking long distances, her clothing practical but distinctly indigenous. A long coat decorated with beadwork, sturdy boots, and a leather bag slung across her shoulder. "Mr. Harrison?" she called out as she reached the porch steps, her voice carrying easily across the still evening air. "My name is Marie Crow Dog. I'm looking for work." Bill stood slowly, his joints protesting after hours in the rocking chair, studying this unexpected visitor with the wariness of a man who'd learned to be suspicious of change. "Don't need any help," he said, his voice roughened by disuse and the approaching winter wind. "And it's getting dark. Nearest town is 15 miles back the way you came." Marie smiled, and something in her expression reminded Bill of Eleanor's particular brand of determination. The look she'd gotten when she'd made up her mind about something and wouldn't be swayed by logic or protest. "I'm a good worker," Marie said simply. "I can cook, clean, handle livestock. I'm also a healer, traditional medicine, some modern too. I've been traveling for 3 months, looking for a place to settle for the winter. Your ranch keeps coming up in conversations." Bill frowned, unable to imagine who might have been discussing his ranch or why. "What conversations?" "People talk," Marie replied, settling herself on the porch steps without invitation, clearly prepared to wait out his resistance. "About the man who's been alone too long, about the ranch that needs tending, about the grief that's been growing like weeds for 20 years. Her words hit Bill like a physical blow, partly because of their accuracy and partly because no one had spoken so directly about his situation in decades. "I don't know what you think you know about my business," he began, but Marie raised a gentle hand to stop him. "I know about loss," she said quietly. "I know about empty houses and silent meals, and the way grief can become so familiar that you're afraid to let it go." The wind picked up, rustling the dried corn stalks in the field beyond the barn, and Bill found himself studying the stranger who spoke about his pain as if she'd been living in his house for years. "I lost my husband 12 years ago," Marie continued. "Lost my daughter 2 years before that. Car accident. Some days I thought the silence would drive me mad." Her honesty was disarming, and Bill felt his carefully constructed walls beginning to crack. "Why here?" he asked finally. "Why my ranch?" Marie looked up at him, her dark eyes reflecting the porch light. "Because sometimes the spirits guide us to where we're needed most," she said. "And sometimes we're guided to where we need to be." Bill didn't sleep well that night. He'd offered Marie the guest room, Eleanor's sewing room that hadn't been used in 20 years, partly out of prairie hospitality and partly because something about her steady presence had made the house feel less empty. He lay in his bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving through his home. Water running in the bathroom, floorboards creaking in the hallway, the soft murmur of what sounded like singing or perhaps praying in a language he didn't recognize. It was unsettling and oddly comforting at the same time. Morning came gray and cold, with the sharp bite of approaching winter in the air. Bill dressed quietly and made his way to the kitchen, expecting to find Marie still asleep. Instead, he discovered her standing at the stove, coffee already brewed and bacon sizzling in Eleanor's cast-iron skillet. She'd changed from her traveling clothes into practical jeans and a flannel shirt, but the eagle feather remained in her hair, a reminder that she was definitely not from around here. "Hope you don't mind," she said without turning around. "I'm an early riser, and I figured if I was going to convince you to let me stay, I should probably start by making myself useful." The breakfast she served was better than anything Bill had eaten in months. Real scrambled eggs, not the powdered stuff he'd been surviving on, bacon cooked just right, and biscuits that reminded him of his mother's. They ate in companionable silence, the morning light streaming through windows that Marie had apparently cleaned while the coffee was brewing. "You don't have to do this," Bill said finally, gesturing toward the spotless kitchen. "I've been managing fine on my own." Marie's smile was gentle but knowing. "Have you?" she asked. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been surviving, not managing." After breakfast, Bill took Marie on a tour of the ranch, partly to show her the scope of the work and partly to test her claims about being able to handle livestock. She moved through the barn with easy confidence, checking the horses' hooves, examining the cattle with a knowledgeable eye, asking intelligent questions about feed schedules and breeding programs. The animals seemed to sense something in her presence. The nervous mare that usually shied away from strangers allowed Marie to approach without hesitation, and even the bad-tempered bull in the far pasture seemed calmer when she spoke to him in that same language Bill had heard her using the night before. "You know what you're doing," Bill admitted grudgingly as they walked back toward the house. "Where'd you learn ranch work?" Marie's expression grew distant, and she was quiet for a long moment before answering. "My husband's family had cattle on the reservation. I spent 15 years learning everything I could about running a ranch. Thought we'd grow old together on that land." Her voice carried the same weight that Bill recognized in his own when he talked about Eleanor. "After he died, I couldn't stay. Too many memories. I've been working ranches across 3 states ever since, never staying long enough to get attached." She looked at him directly then, her dark eyes serious. "But I'm tired of running, Mr. Harrison, and I think maybe you're tired of sitting still." The first test came during the 3rd week of October when an early blizzard swept across the Kansas plains with the fury of a full winter storm. Bill woke to find 3 feet of snow blocking the roads and his cattle huddled against the barn, their breath steaming in the bitter air. This was the kind of emergency that had always sent Eleanor into overdrive, organizing supplies and contingency plans while Bill focused on the animals. For 20 years, he'd handled these crises alone, often losing livestock he might have saved with an extra pair of hands. Marie appeared in the kitchen before dawn, already dressed in layers and pulling on work boots. "Storm's going to get worse before it gets better," she said, checking the battery-powered radio for weather updates. "We need to get the cattle into the near pasture and make sure the water tanks don't freeze." Bill was surprised by her take-charge attitude and even more surprised by how naturally he fell into step behind her. They worked together through the howling wind and driving snow, moving cattle, breaking ice, checking fencing that threatened to collapse under the weight of accumulated snow. By afternoon, when the worst of the storm had passed, they'd managed to save every animal and keep the essential systems running. They sat in the kitchen afterward, exhausted and soaked through, sharing coffee laced with the brandy Eleanor had kept for medicinal purposes. "You did good out there," Bill said, and meant it. Marie had worked without complaint for 8 straight hours, never asking for breaks or special consideration, handling the physical demands of ranch work with a competence that impressed him. "So did you," she replied, "for a man who's been doing this alone for 20 years. That evening, as they sat by the fire that Marie had built in the fireplace Bill hadn't used since Eleanor's death, she told him more about her background. She'd grown up on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, learned traditional healing practices from her grandmother, married young to a man who'd taught her everything about ranching. "We had plans," she said, staring into the flames. "Going to expand the operation, maybe start a program to teach young people from the reservation about sustainable agriculture. Then David got sick. Cancer. Same as your wife, and everything just stopped. After he died, I tried to keep the ranch going, but the debt was too much. Lost everything except what I could carry." She gestured toward the leather bag she'd brought with her, which Bill now realized contained everything she owned in the world. "I've been carrying his ashes with me ever since, looking for the right place to let him rest." The honesty of her confession struck Bill deeply. Here was someone who understood not just loss, but the particular weight of carrying the dead with you wherever you went. "What makes a place right?" he asked quietly. Marie looked around the warm, firelit room, then back at him. "I think you know when you find it," she said. November brought a different kind of quiet to the ranch. The frantic pace of preparing for winter had given way to the steady rhythm of daily maintenance. Feeding cattle, checking water systems, mending equipment in the barn while the Kansas wind howled outside. Bill found himself looking forward to these shared tasks in a way that surprised him. Marie had a gift for comfortable silence, working alongside him for hours without feeling the need to fill every moment with conversation. But when they did talk, her observations about the land, the animals, and the weather revealed a depth of knowledge that came from genuine love of ranch life. It was during one of these quiet November afternoons, while they worked together to repair a section of fence damaged by the early storm, that Marie told him about her daughter. "Rebecca was 28 when she died," she said, her hands steady on the wire cutters despite the emotion in her voice. "She was a teacher on the reservation, working with kids who'd been written off by everyone else. Brilliant, beautiful, full of plans to change the world." Bill felt his chest tighten, recognizing the particular pain of a parent outliving their child. A loss he'd been spared but had watched Eleanor grieve when they'd lost 3 babies before giving up on having children. "She was driving to a conference in Denver when it happened," Marie continued. "Ice storm, lost control on a mountain curve. The call came at 3 in the morning. David never really recovered from it. The cancer came 2 years later, but I think he'd already started dying the night we lost Rebecca." She set down her tools and looked across the pasture where Bill's cattle grazed peacefully in the weak afternoon sun. "I spent years being angry at God, at the world, at David for leaving me to carry all that grief alone. It wasn't until I started traveling that I began to understand that grief doesn't have to be a burden you carry. It can be a bridge that connects you to other people who understand loss." That evening, Bill found himself talking about Eleanor in ways he hadn't for years. Not just the sanitized memories he'd polished smooth with repetition, but the real woman, her terrible singing voice, her tendency to cry at sad movies, the way she'd argued with him about everything from politics to the proper way to plant tomatoes. "She wanted children so badly," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "After the 3rd miscarriage, the doctor said it wasn't safe to keep trying. Eleanor blamed herself, even though I told her 1,000 times it wasn't her fault. I think she spent the rest of her life trying to make up for the children we never had." Marie listened without judgment, occasionally asking gentle questions that helped him excavate memories he'd buried under 20 years of solitude. "Do you think she'd want you to spend the rest of your life mourning her?" she asked finally. Bill considered the question seriously, thinking about the woman who'd been his partner for over 5 decades. She'd probably tell me to stop being so stubborn and accept help when it's offered, he admitted. Eleanor never had patience for self-pity. Marie smiled. She sounds like a wise woman. Bill looked at this woman who'd appeared in his life like an answer to a prayer he'd been afraid to say out loud. She was, he said quietly. But so are you. The first major snowfall of December brought with it a decision that Bill had been avoiding for weeks. Marie had proven herself invaluable. The ranch was running better than it had in years. The house felt like a home again, and the isolation that had nearly broken him was replaced by a companionship he hadn't dared hope for. But winter arrangements that made sense in October started to feel more complicated as the holiday season approached. The neighbors had begun to notice Marie's presence, and while no one had said anything directly, Bill could feel the weight of small-town speculation every time he went to the feed store or the diner. "You know they're talking," Marie said one morning as they worked together to clear snow from the barn roof. She didn't sound upset, just matter of fact, but Bill could see the tension in her shoulders. Small towns are the same everywhere. Lonely widower, mysterious Indian woman. It's the kind of story that writes itself in people's minds. Bill felt heat rise in his cheeks, not from embarrassment but from anger at the unfairness of it. Marie had done nothing but work hard and bring life back to his ranch, and the idea that people might be judging her for it made his blood boil. "I don't care what they say," he said, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. "This is my land, my house. If I want to hire help, that's my business." Marie climbed down from the ladder and studied his face carefully. "Is that what this is? A business arrangement?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that Bill wasn't sure he was ready to face. Over the past 2 months, their relationship had evolved into something that felt like much more than employer and employee, but neither of them had been willing to name it. That evening, as they decorated Eleanor's old Christmas tree with ornaments that hadn't seen light in 20 years, the conversation they'd been avoiding finally surfaced. "I need to know where this is heading," Marie said as she hung a delicate glass angel that Eleanor had treasured. "Not because I'm in any hurry, but because I can't keep pretending that what's happening between us is just about ranch work." Bill felt his heart skip in a way that reminded him of being 17 and asking Eleanor to the county fair dance. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I never thought I'd feel anything for another woman after Eleanor. Hell, I never thought I'd feel anything again, period. But being with you, it's like waking up from a 20-year sleep." He paused, looking at the woman who'd brought light back into his dark house. "I know I'm too old for you. No, I don't have any right to ask you to tie your life to mine. But if you're willing to stay, if you think we might have something worth building, then I'd like to try." Marie's smile was radiant as she reached for his weathered hand. "Bill Harrison," she said softly, "I've been waiting my whole life for someone to ask me that question. The answer is yes." January brought the kind of bitter cold that made the Kansas prairie feel like the edge of the world. The pipes froze twice, the old furnace wheezed and struggled to heat the house, and the cattle huddled together in whatever shelter they could find. But inside the farmhouse, a different kind of warmth was growing. Bill and Marie had settled into the rhythm of a partnership that felt both new and ancient, as if they'd been waiting their whole lives to find each other despite the grief and loss that had brought them to this point. The town's reaction to their relationship had been predictably mixed. The older residents, particularly those who remembered Eleanor, seemed to view Marie with suspicion, while the younger generation was more accepting. Bill's nearest neighbor, Tom Kowalski, had made his disapproval clear during a January visit that felt more like an intervention. "I'm not saying she's not a good worker," Tom had said, his voice carefully neutral as he sat in Bill's kitchen. "But people are wondering about your intentions, whether this is appropriate for a man of your standing in the community." Bill had listened to the concerns with growing irritation, finally cutting Tom off mid-sentence. "My wife has been dead for 20 years, he said firmly. "I've done my grieving, paid my dues to loneliness. If I found someone who makes me want to live again instead of just survive, that's nobody's business but mine." Tom had left soon after, and Bill suspected the conversation would be repeated throughout the county within a week. but he found that he truly didn't care what people thought. At 73, he was too old to waste time on other people's opinions. Marie, for her part, seemed untroubled by the social dynamics of rural Kansas life. She'd faced worse prejudices in her travels, and the solid foundation of their partnership gave her strength to weather the whispered conversations and sideways glances. "My grandmother used to say that the spirits send us what we need when we're ready to receive it," she told Bill one evening as they sat by the fire. "Maybe we had to lose everything before we could find each other." The truth of her words became even clearer when Marie finally showed Bill what she carried in her leather bag. Along with David's ashes, she'd brought photographs of her life before. Pictures of her daughter Rebecca, images of the ranch she'd lost, mementos of a happiness that had been destroyed by tragedy and debt. "I've been carrying this with me for 12 years, she said, spreading the photographs on the kitchen table. "Afraid to let go, afraid to move forward. But being here with you, I think I'm finally ready to let David rest." She looked up at Bill with tears in her eyes. "Would you help me find a good place on your land? Somewhere he can watch over the cattle and feel the wind from the prairie." March brought the first real warmth to the Kansas plains, and with it a sense of renewal that Bill hadn't experienced in decades. He and Marie had chosen a spot on the hill overlooking the main pasture for David's final resting place, a ceremony that had been both heartbreaking and healing. Marie had spoken in her native language while Bill stood beside her, offering the silent support of someone who understood the weight of letting go. The eagle feather she always wore had finally found its purpose. She'd placed it on the small cairn of stones they'd built, a marker that would weather the prairie winds for generations. The ranch was thriving under their joint management. The cattle were healthy, the spring calving had gone better than it had in years, and they'd even started talking about expanding the operation. Marie's knowledge of sustainable agriculture, combined with Bill's decades of experience, had created efficiencies that neither could have achieved alone. They'd applied for grants to implement water conservation measures and were planning to attend a conference on heritage breed cattle, something Bill never would have considered in his years of isolation. But the most significant change was in Bill himself. The depression that had settled over him like a fog after Eleanor's death had finally lifted. He woke each morning with purpose, looked forward to the day's work, and had even started making plans that extended beyond the immediate needs of survival. Marie had suggested they host a summer barbecue for the neighbors, a way of reintroducing himself to the community and showing people that their relationship was built on genuine partnership rather than convenience. The idea terrified and excited him in equal measure. For 20 years, he'd hidden from social interaction, convinced that his grief made him unfit for normal human relationships. But Marie's presence had taught him that healing didn't require forgetting. It required the courage to remain open to new experiences while honoring the memory of what came before. "Eleanor would have loved you," he told Marie one evening as they planned the menu for the barbecue. "She always said I needed someone to push me out of my comfort zone." Marie smiled and kissed his cheek gently. "Maybe she sent me to you," she said. "Maybe the spirits work through love as much as loss." The barbecue they hosted in June turned out to be the social event of the summer for their corner of Kansas. Bill had been nervous for weeks leading up to it, worried that people would come out of curiosity rather than genuine friendship, that Marie would be subjected to scrutiny and judgment that would make her uncomfortable. Instead, he discovered that most of their neighbors had been waiting for an invitation to get to know the woman who'd brought their reclusive neighbor back to life. Marie charmed everyone with her stories of ranch life in South Dakota, her knowledge of traditional healing practices, and her obvious competence in every aspect of farm management. The women were particularly impressed by her ability to gentle the most difficult horses, while the men respected her understanding of cattle breeding and pasture management. By the end of the evening, she'd been invited to join the county fair planning committee and asked to teach a workshop on traditional plant medicine at the community college. "You were worried for nothing," Marie told him as they cleaned up the last of the dishes that night. "Good people are good people, regardless of where they come from. It just takes time for them to see past their assumptions." Bill marveled at her wisdom and her patience. She'd faced down decades of his own assumptions and fears, not to mention the prejudices of an entire community, with grace and dignity that humbled him. At 74, he was learning lessons about courage that he should have learned decades ago. As summer progressed, their relationship deepened into something that felt inevitable and right. They'd moved past the awkwardness of new romance into the comfortable intimacy of true partnership. Marie kept the eagle feather in her hair, a reminder of her heritage and her journey, but she'd also begun wearing Eleanor's old wedding ring on a chain around her neck, not as a replacement, but as a symbol of the continuity of love that transcends individual relationships. "Some people only get one chance at love," she said. "We're lucky enough to get two." The town had gradually accepted them as a couple, helped by their obvious happiness and the positive changes their partnership had brought to the ranch. Even Tom Kowalski had grudgingly admitted that Bill seemed like a new man, and that Marie's influence had been nothing but positive. When they announced their engagement in late August, the response was overwhelmingly supportive, with offers to help plan the wedding and suggestions for the best venues in the county. They were married on a perfect October morning, exactly 1 year after Marie had first appeared at Bill's gate. The ceremony took place in the pasture where they'd scattered David's ashes, with the eagle feather that had marked his resting place incorporated into Marie's wedding bouquet. Bill wore his father's old suit, while Marie chose a simple white dress decorated with traditional beadwork that told the story of their courtship in symbols that spoke to both her heritage and their shared future. The entire county seemed to turn out for the celebration. The same neighbors who'd once whispered about the appropriateness of their relationship now lined up to congratulate them and offer best wishes for their future together. Bill's best man was Tom Kowalski, who'd overcome his initial skepticism to become one of their strongest supporters. Marie's matron of honor was Eleanor's best friend, Ruth Morrison, who told everyone within earshot that Eleanor would have been thrilled to see Bill so happy again. As they exchanged vows under the vast Kansas sky, Bill reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 20 years of grief and isolation had nearly broken him, but they'd also prepared him to recognize the gift of second chances when it appeared. Marie had taught him that love didn't diminish with sharing, that honoring the past didn't require sacrificing the future, and that the human heart was capable of healing even the deepest wounds given enough time and courage. The ranch that had once been a monument to loss had become a testament to renewal. They'd already started making plans for the future. A scholarship fund in Rebecca's name for young Native Americans pursuing careers in education, a mentorship program for beginning ranchers, maybe even a book about sustainable agriculture practices that combine traditional Native knowledge with modern farming techniques. At 74 and 53, they were proof that it's never too late to start over, never too late to choose love over fear. As the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in the colors that Eleanor had always called God's masterpiece, Bill and Marie stood hand in hand, watching their neighbors dance under the stars. The eagle feather in Marie's hair caught the light of the Japanese lanterns they'd strung between the trees, and Bill felt Eleanor's presence like a blessing on the wind. 20 winters of solitude had ended with the arrival of a woman who'd carried her own grief across 3 states to find him. Now they would face whatever winters remained together, 2 hearts that had been broken by loss and healed by the patient, transformative power of love.